Okay, final video for chapter 10. We're doing 10-5 and 10-21. First, we're looking at our fixed overhead variances. So we have Happy Valley Pet Products using a standard costing system. We have their total budgeted fixed overhead, actual, budgeted standard direct labor hours versus actual, and then the standard direct labor hours allowed for actual output. So we want to compute the fixed portion of the predetermined overhead rate for the year. And then we want to compute the fixed overhead budget and volume variances. And then we're going to take it one step further, and we're actually going to do a reconciliation of our underapplied fixed overhead to the budget and volume variances. Okay, so this first part is really just looking at our budgeted fixed overhead costs for the year and our denominator level of activity, which is going to be our budgeted standard direct labor hours. Okay, so again, predetermined overhead rate, we're dealing with estimates, so we're dealing with our budgeted amounts. Okay, so 40,000 divided by our denominator level of activity, which in this case is 10,000 direct labor hours. So when we actually use Excel, we get, oh, sorry, I should have moved that over a cell. Sorry about that. Let's try that again. 40,000 divided by 10,000 gives us an amount of $4, and this is per direct labor hour. Okay. So now that we have that, we can look at our variances. So we start off with our budget variance, which takes our actual fixed overhead cost and relates it to the flexible budget fixed overhead cost. Okay, so our actual fixed overhead cost we know is 38,000. It's given to us right in that little chart, the second one down, our actual fixed overhead cost for the year. We want to subtract from that the flexible budget fixed overhead cost, which we know is 40,000. Okay, and obviously we're going to have a negative amount returned, which actually tells us that this is a favorable variance. Okay, and that's because we spent 2,000 less than what we estimated. Okay. Next part is looking at our volume variance. So we're taking the fixed portion of our predetermined overhead rate, which we just calculated at being $4, and we're multiplying that by our denominator hours minus our standard hours. Okay. So in this, our denominator hours were 10,000, right? And our standard direct labor hours that we allowed for actual output was 9,000. Okay, so something to keep in mind here is we're not even talking about our actual direct labor hours of 12,000 in any of this. Okay, we are looking at the denominator hours in our predetermined overhead rate and the standard direct labor hours that are allowed for that actual level of output, which would have been 9,000. Okay, so when we put this into Excel, 4 times 10,000 minus 9,000, the equal sign, is going to return an amount of 4,000. And again, this came back as a positive number. The standard number of hours allowed are less than what we used in that predetermined overhead rate. So we have an unfavorable variance. Okay. So when we reconcile this, it just helps to wrap our brains around kind of what we're looking at here. Okay. If we have an unfavorable variance, we have underapplied overhead. Okay. So our actual fixed overhead was 38,000, okay, given to us in the question. The amount of overhead that would have been applied is based off of our standard direct labor hours. Okay, so it would have been 9,000 times our predetermined overhead rate of 4, giving us an amount of 36,000. Okay, 38 minus 36 means that we have an amount of 2,000 being our underapplied overhead. Okay. Our budget variance was 2,000 favorable. Our volume variance was 4,000 unfavorable. Oops. Okay. The difference between our 4,000 unfavorable and our 2,000 favorable is going to be 2,000 unfavorable. Okay. So again, our underapplied overhead is equal to our unfavorable variance. Again, if you have any questions about this, bring them to class on Monday. You can always email me and we can go over it before then if you want to address it before Monday. But if you are happy to wait, then bring any questions to the Monday class on campus or the Tuesday class via Teams or both, and we can address any questions you have at that point. So finally, we have a question that kind of brings together all of these variances that we're looking at and how we use them in the analysis process. So we have Vital Aid manufacturing a vacuum sealed high protein food supplement. They use a variable costing system in conjunction with standard costing and have established the following standards for one package of Vital Aid bars. So this is our standard cost card. Okay, it gives us our standard quantity of materials or hours, our standard price or rate. Okay, so we get a total standard variable cost of $7.85. We're given additional information about what happened during October. Okay, how many bars they produced, how much material was used and what it cost, okay, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to read through all of these just yet. We'll do that as we're pulling information from the question. So we want to compute the price and quantity variance, okay, for direct materials, and then we want to comment on what those variances mean. The material was purchased from a new supplier who's anxious to enter into a long-term purchase contract, and we need to recommend if the company should go ahead with that. Next, we're going to compute the rate and efficiency variances for labor employed in the production. In the past, the 5 people employed consisted of 3 senior workers and 2 assistants. During October, the company experimented with 4 senior workers and 1 assistant, and we want to recommend if that new labor mix be continued. And then finally, we're going to compute the variable overhead spending and efficiency variances and comment on any relationship that we could see between the efficiency variance and the labor efficiency variance. So the first part of this is to pull the relevant information from the question for the formulas that we're going to be using. Okay, when it comes to materials, we're going to start by looking at our actual quantity, our actual price, standard quantity, and standard price. Okay, so if we go back to the question, we can see that a total of 1,800 kilograms of material was purchased at a cost of $19,800. Okay, so our actual quantity then is going to be 1,800 kilograms. The actual price of that, okay, it costs $19,800, so 19,800, and we're going to divide that by our actual quantity of 1,800, which gives us a cost of $11 per kilogram. Okay. In terms of standard quantity, the company produced 4,000 packages. Okay. Actually, I'm going to do this up here for a minute. 4,000 packages. And the standard quantity of direct materials is 350 grams. Okay. But everything else we're dealing with is in kilograms. So we're going to take this amount and we're going to divide by 1,000 because there's 1,000 grams in 1 kilogram. Okay. And that's going to give us our standard quantity of 1,400 kilograms. Okay. Next, we're going to look at standard price, and this was given to us. Those materials should cost $12 per kilogram. Okay. So we have everything we need for our materials variance. So next, let's look at our labor variance. Okay, our actual hours in labor. So the company employs 5 people. Okay, each employee worked an average of 185 hours, which gives us actual hours of 925. Each employee works an average of 185 hours at an average rate of $14 per hour. So that is our actual rate. Okay. Our standard hours, we have to go back to our chart. Okay, we know that we have 4,000 packages and that they should require 0.25 direct labor hours, okay, each. So our standard hours should be 1,000. And our standard rate given to us in the chart is $13 per direct labor hour. Now we have everything we need to do our labor variances. We can pull our information for our variable overhead. Okay, our variable overhead is assigned on the basis of direct labor hours. Okay, so we see that in E, variable manufacturing overhead is assigned to Vital Aid on the basis of direct labor hours. Variable manufacturing overhead cost during October totaled 1,850. So our actual hours are going to be the same actual hours that we calculated for labor, okay, 925. In terms of actual rate, we're going to take our variable manufacturing overhead costs during October, which were 1,850, and we're going to divide by our actual hours of 925. I'm not going to do that cell reference though, because then it screws up my formulas later, okay, which gives me an actual rate of $2. My standard hours, according to the chart, right, and what we figured out for our labor variances is 1,000. Okay, that's the same. And our standard rate for overhead is $1.60 per hour. So now we have all of our information. It's simply a matter of putting that information into our formulas. Okay, so our materials price variance is our actual quantity multiplied by our actual price minus our standard price. Okay, and that's going to return an amount of 1,800. Again, it's appearing as a negative number, which tells us it's actually a favorable variance. Okay, which makes sense because our actual price is $1 less than our standard price. So we spent $1 less per unit than we were expecting, right? So next we're going to look at our materials quantity variance. So our standard price was 12, and we multiply that by our actual quantity minus our standard quantity, and that's going to give us an amount of 4,800, and it's displaying as a positive number, which means that this is going to be an unfavorable variance. Okay? Did I put that in correctly? Something looks off. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Yeah, no, everything looks correct. I'm not sure why that looks off. Anyways, so we can see that we have quite a large unfavorable variance in terms of our quantity, right? Which makes sense because our standard quantity is a lot lower than our actual quantity, right? So we expected to use a lot less in terms of materials. So should this new contract be signed? I would say that no, it probably shouldn't be signed, okay? Even though our price is $1 cheaper than the standard, we are using far more of the product, right? So if we have to use more, even though it costs less, we're not actually saving any money. Okay, so no, it shouldn't be entered into, right? Because our net total variance, adding this together because it's a negative number, right? Our total variance is 3,000 unfavorable. Okay, so even with the amount that we're saving, we still have an overall unfavorable variance. So the next thing we're going to look at is our labor rate variance. Again, I isolated all of my information already so that I can just pop it into my formulas. Okay, my actual hours, 925, multiplied by my actual rate of 14 minus my standard rate of 13 is going to give me a variance of 925. Okay, which looks a little bit funny because it's actually equal to the number of hours, but anyways, it displayed as a positive number, which we know means that that is an unfavorable variance, right? Which makes sense because our actual rate is 14, where we were expecting to pay 13. So next, we're going to look at our labor efficiency. So our standard rate of 13, our actual hours minus our standard hours. Okay. Why didn't you like that? Just type it in to get around that. So 925 multiplied by 925 minus 1,000. Why? Oh, I put 925 instead of our standard rate of 13. Haha, sorry about that. I'll be okay. Okay, so this returns as a negative number, which we know is a favorable variance, right? Which makes sense because our standard hours were 1,000 and our actual hours were 925, right? So we used less actual hours than what we were expecting to according to the standard. And these variances are likely in relation to our new work or labor mix, right? So in the past, the 5 people employed in the production consisted of 3 senior workers and 2 assistants. During October, the company experimented with 4 senior workers and 1 assistant. So would we recommend if continuing that labor mix? Okay. And I would say that by looking at this, that we probably should continue it, right? Because even though it increased the average hourly labor cost from $13 to $14, causing that 925 unfavorable labor rate variance, it's offset by the greater efficiency of labor time. Okay, the labor efficiency variance is 975 on the favorable side. Okay, so our overall variance is just a difference of 50, but it's still to the favorable side, which means that the new labor mix reduces our overall labor cost. Okay, so yes, we should continue. The new mix is going to reduce our overall labor. Okay, labor costs. And lastly, we want to look at our overhead. So again, we've isolated all of our information that we can put directly into our formulas. So for our variable overhead spending variance, our actual hours, we know are 925. Okay, we're going to multiply that by our actual rate, which was $2, minus our standard rate of $1.60. And that's going to give us a variance of 370, which appears as a positive number, which means it's an unfavorable variance, right? Which makes sense if we look at our actual rate being more than our standard rate, okay? Looking at efficiency, though, if we take our standard rate of $1.60 and multiply by our actual hours minus our standard hours, we get an amount of 120 appearing as a negative number, which means it is a favorable variance. Okay? So, is there a relationship between overhead efficiency variance and labor efficiency variance? Well, yeah, right? Because they're based on a lot of the same things, right? Both the labor efficiency variance and the variable overhead efficiency variance are computed by comparing our actual labor hours to our standard labor hours. So if our labor efficiency variance is favorable, then the variable overhead efficiency variance will be favorable as well, okay, because they have those components in common. Okay, so I'll type out what I just said so that you're sure to catch it, okay? Both the labor efficiency and the variable overhead efficiency, I'm not used to this keyboard anymore, are computed by comparing actual labor hours to our standard labor hours. Okay, so if the labor efficiency variance is favorable, then the variable overhead efficiency. Sorry guys, I'm not used to this keyboard now that I'm on campus more. Will be favorable as well. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the chapter 10 questions. The next video will be the chapter 12 PowerPoint, and then there will be another series of smaller videos for the chapter 12 questions.